She was 43 years old, and she had been erased. That was the only word that fitted, not ruined, not humbled, not set back, erased, the way a name is erased from a deed when the man who holds the pen decides the name no longer belongs there. The Oregon Territory Land Consolidation Act of 1889 had given certain county commissioners the authority to absorb privately held parcels into public infrastructure trusts under conditions of disputed title, and Commissioner Harlan Prudhoe of Coos County had used that authority with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for the law to catch up to his intentions. Maren Elstad had owned 41 acres on the Millhaven River for 19 years, had cleared it, farmed it, raised a son on it, and in the February of 1891 she had watched a county surveyor plant flags across her fields while Prudhoe stood at the fence line in a good coat and did not meet her eyes. What remained was Maren herself, a carpetbag, and $11 she had kept in a tobacco tin beneath the floorboards and therefore kept. The rotting-covered bridge at the edge of Sorrow Flat had not drawn a single bid at 3 consecutive county auctions. It spanned a narrow branch of the Millhaven that had shifted course years earlier, leaving the bridge connecting one muddy bank to another with no road on either end, its roof warping, its siding gaping, its timber floor suspect in 4 places at least, the whole structure regarded by the residents of Sorrow Flat as an embarrassment they were too busy to demolish. Maren Elstad paid $11 for it on a gray Thursday morning and was considered, by everyone who heard about it, to have lost her mind along with her land. What was hidden in the rafters of that bridge, what a man had sealed up there years before and never come back for, would not only change the course of Maren Elstad's life but would return to the families of Sorrow Flat something they had been quietly cheated out of for longer than most of them knew. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Maren Elstad. If you have ever had something taken from you by someone who had the power to make the taking look legal, tell us about it in the comments below. Maren had been born in the coastal country of western Norway, in a village so small it existed on no map that a person outside the county would have reason to consult, the second child of a boat builder named Einar Holt and his wife Sigrid, who kept the family's accounts and also kept, in a separate leather-bound book she allowed no one else to touch, a running record of every obligation and kindness the family had exchanged with its neighbors, not debts exactly, but a kind of moral ledger, a register of the invisible currency that holds a community together when the visible kind runs short. Sigrid called this book her reckoning, and she updated it each Sunday evening by the fire while Einar read aloud from whatever he had on hand, and the sound of that Sunday ritual, the scratch of her pen, his low unhurried voice, the fire, the wind off the water, was the first texture of Maren's understanding of what it meant to live among people with intention. Einar built boats the way certain men build things when they love both the material and the purpose equally, not quickly, not showily, but with a precision that amounted to a kind of devotion. He taught Maren to read timber the way a doctor reads a patient, with patience, with the hands as much as the eyes, with an understanding that the surface told you almost nothing and the interior told you almost everything. He showed her how to find the heartwood, how to judge the straightness of a grain by the angle of the light, how to hear the difference between a tap that rang solid and one that carried the faint hollow note of concealed decay. These were not lessons he announced. They were simply the ambient instruction of a life lived alongside someone who knew things and was willing to share them without making the sharing into a performance. They came to Oregon in 1871, Einar and Sigrid and Maren, then 23, and her younger brother Petter, then 19, crossing on a ship that smelled of tar and salt and the particular concentrated humanity of people who have decided to become someone else's neighbors in a country they have not yet seen. They settled in the Millhaven Valley because a man from their village had settled there 2 years earlier and had written back to say the timber was extraordinary and the soil in the valley bottoms would grow anything with patience. He had not been wrong about either thing. Einar took 40 acres on the north bank of the river and built a house in the first summer that was small but entirely sound, the kind of house that announced, through the evenness of its joints and the careful fitting of its foundation stones, that the person who built it intended to stay. Petter took a smaller parcel adjoining and began farming it with a single-mindedness that Maren recognized as her father's quality transplanted into her brother's less patient character. Maren worked both parcels through those early years, helping Einar with the building and Petter with the clearing, and she learned the land the way she had learned timber, by putting her hands on it, by going slowly, by listening to what it told her about itself before she asked it to do anything. She married a man named Arvid Elstad in 1874, a Norwegian carpenter from the valley 2 ridges over, a quiet man with a gift for structural work and a steadiness that she recognized and trusted. They built their own house on the 41 acres Einar deeded to them in the year of the marriage, and they built it together, which was not common then but which was the only way either of them thought to do it, since they were both people who understood building from the inside and neither of them had any interest in watching while the other worked. Their son, Christopher, was born in 1876 and grew up on those 41 acres with the particular freedom of a child who has both the space to roam and parents attentive enough to have made the space safe without making it small. He had his grandfather Einar's hands and his grandmother Sigrid's instinct for the moral weight of things, and Maren loved him with the steady, unsentimental love of someone who sees clearly what a person is made of and finds it worth loving. Arvid died in the winter of 1883, a structural collapse at a mill he had been contracted to repair, a beam that had been assessed as sound and was not. He was there one Tuesday and gone by Wednesday, and Maren received the news in the way that people receive certain news, not with collapse, because collapse comes later, when the initial shock releases its grip and you understand that the thing you have just been told is actually true and permanent, but with the flat, temporary stillness of someone who has not yet found the edge of what they are standing on. She ran the 41 acres alone after that, which was not easy and was not meant to be easy, and she did it because Christopher was 7 and the land was his inheritance and she was not a woman who walked away from the things she was responsible for. She hired day labor at harvest and did the rest herself, and she kept Sigrid's practice of the reckoning book, recording the obligations and kindnesses that moved between herself and her neighbors in the same leather-bound format her mother had used, because it seemed to her that this practice was one of the things worth carrying from one life into the next. Christopher grew, and helped, and at 16 was doing the work of a grown man on the land, and Maren had allowed herself, by 1888, to believe that the worst was behind her and that the 41 acres would hold. She had not accounted for Harlan Prudhoe. Prudhoe had been appointed county commissioner in 1887, having campaigned on the platform of infrastructure development and regional growth, which were words that sounded like community benefit and meant, in his specific usage, the systematic accumulation of land by a small group of men who understood how to use public authority for private ends. He had identified the Millhaven Valley early in his tenure as an area of significant timber value, and he had set about, with methodical patience, identifying the parcels that could be absorbed under the disputed title provisions of the 1889 Act, a law he had helped draft through a relationship with a territorial legislator whose name Maren would not learn until much later. Her title was not, in any honest reading, disputed. The deed was clean, the survey was registered, and the property tax had been paid without exception for 15 years. But Prudhoe had a surveyor who could find ambiguities where none existed and a county clerk who could lose filings that were inconvenient and a territorial judge who owed him something Maren never learned the nature of. He filed the absorption claim in November of 1890, and by February of 1891, after 3 hearings at which Maren appeared without an attorney because she could not afford one and was advised by the judge, in the measured tone of a man performing the appearance of fairness, that the matter had been reviewed thoroughly and the findings stood, she walked off her land for the last time with a carpetbag and $11 and her reckoning book and the absolute clarity of someone who has just watched an injustice be completed in full view of everyone and understood that the view did not trouble the people with the power to stop it. Christopher was in the valley 2 ridges over by then, working timber with a crew, and she sent him word of what had happened but told him to stay where he was, that she would manage, that she would find a way to make something from what remained. She was not certain she believed it when she wrote it. She wrote it anyway, because it was the kind of thing her mother's reckoning book would have counted as an obligation she owed her son, the obligation not to make him carry her fear on top of his own. She arrived in Sorrow Flat in the first week of March, 1891, having heard from a woman at a stage stop that the small town on the lower Millhaven had a boarding house and a general store and possibly some need for a woman who could keep accounts and read timber and was not afraid of work. Sorrow Flat was a town of perhaps 300 people, most of them loggers or the families of loggers, arranged along a single main street above the river with the permanent slightly damp smell of a place that lives in the shadow of large trees. It had a church, a school that was open 3 days a week for lack of a permanent teacher, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Brandt who was approximately 70 and appeared to find the entire situation of being alive mildly amusing, and a covered bridge at the western edge of town that spanned a branch of the river that had, years ago, shifted its primary course southward and left the bridge serving no practical purpose that anyone still living could clearly articulate. Maren stood at the bridge on her second day in Sorrow Flat and looked at it for a long time. It was a substantial structure, longer than most covered bridges she had seen, perhaps 80 feet, with a timber truss system visible through the gaps in its siding that her father would have recognized and respected. The siding boards had warped and in places fallen away entirely, and the roof shingles had lifted at the edges so that light entered in long diagonal bars that caught the river mist and made the interior glow faintly even on a gray day. The floor was compromised in the places she could identify from the outside, a visible sag roughly a third of the way across, and a second soft zone near the far portal, but the trusses themselves, what she could see of them, still carried their load. The frame had settled, but it had settled evenly, which her father had always said was the distinction that mattered, not whether a thing had aged, but whether it had aged honestly. She also noticed, in the way that she noticed things when she was looking carefully rather than casually, that the rafters above the truss line were deeper than the structure required, and that there was a section of the upper rafter space near the north wall of the bridge, visible through a gap in the interior cladding, where something appeared to have been wrapped and wedged between two horizontal members. She could not make it out from outside. She filed the observation away and went back to Mrs. Brandt's boarding house and asked, over supper, who owned the bridge. The county, Mrs. Brandt said, had owned it since the Halverson estate dissolved in 1887. It had been listed at auction 3 times. Nobody had bid. What would anybody do with a bridge that went from mud to mud? Maren paid $11 at the county land office on a Thursday morning. The agent, a young man who appeared to have been assigned this posting as some form of mild professional punishment, processed the paperwork with the expression of someone who had stopped trying to understand human decision-making and found the surrender restful. She had the bridge key, a large iron skeleton key that the county had kept on a hook in the land office, and she used it the following morning to unlock the pedestrian gate at the east portal, which swung open with a sound like something that had been holding its breath finally releasing it. She walked the full length of the bridge first, testing the floor with each step, mapping the soft zones by feel the way her father had taught her, pressing her heel down slightly harder at regular intervals and noting where the give exceeded what was safe and where it was merely age. The compromised section near the east end was worse than it had appeared from outside, a full 4-foot span where the decking had separated from the joists below and would not support weight, but the remainder of the floor was sound, and the truss system above was, she confirmed with her hands and her eyes working together, entirely intact. Whoever had built this bridge had built it to outlast the river it crossed, and it very nearly had. She climbed to the rafters on her second morning, using a timber-runged access ladder fixed to the interior north wall that she had identified on her first walk-through. The ladder was old but solid, iron-bolted at each rung, the kind of fastening that said the builder had expected it to be used and had not wanted it to fail. The rafter space was lower than she had expected and warmer, the trapped air of years. She moved along the horizontal members on hands and knees, her lantern held in one hand, and she found it within 3 minutes of reaching the top of the ladder, a canvas bundle, perhaps 2 feet long and 8 inches wide, wedged between 2 rafter beams with a deliberateness that was unmistakable. It had been tied with waxed cord, the kind used for waterproofing, and wrapped in a second layer of oilskin beneath the canvas. Someone had taken considerable care to protect whatever was inside from moisture and time. She brought it down the ladder and set it on a dry section of the bridge floor and crouched over it in the angled morning light and untied the waxed cord slowly, because she had learned from her father that the way you opened a thing told you something about what you were prepared to find inside. The oilskin peeled back to reveal a leather satchel, dark with age but uncracked, its brass clasp still functional. She opened the clasp. Inside were papers, a substantial sheaf of them, folded in thirds, each one protected by a separate sleeve of waxed paper. She lifted the first one and unfolded it in the bar of light that came through the gap in the siding above. It was a survey map. Hand-drawn, meticulously detailed, covering an area she recognized immediately as the Millhaven Valley, her valley, the valley she had been taken from, but drawn at a date she could read in the corner notation as 1879, more than a decade before Prudhoe had filed his absorption claims. The map showed property boundaries. It showed registered parcel numbers. And in the lower right corner, in a hand she did not recognize, were written 4 words that she read twice before she allowed herself to understand them: original survey. Halverson. Certified. She sat back on her heels and looked at the map for a very long time. Then she lifted the second paper from the satchel. It was a letter, dated March 1886, addressed to a man named Edmund Halverson, whom she would later learn had been the bridge's original owner and one of the valley's founding settlers, from a territorial surveyor named Callum Fitch, and it described in the careful language of a man documenting something he expected to need documented later: a discrepancy between the official county survey records filed after 1887 and the original survey conducted by Fitch himself in 1879. The discrepancy was not minor. The official records, Fitch wrote, had been altered, specific parcel boundaries redrawn, registration numbers reassigned, a systematic revision of the underlying record that would, if accepted as authoritative, leave certain landowners without the documentation to defend their titles against an absorption claim. The letter named the county clerk responsible for the alterations. It named the commissioner who had directed them. The commissioner's name was Harlan Prudhoe. The satchel held 11 more documents. She read all of them in the rafter light of the bridge, sitting on the repaired section of floor with the river running slowly below her, and by the time the light began to change toward afternoon she understood the complete architecture of what Halverson had known, what he had hidden, and why he had hidden it in the rafters of a bridge that belonged to him and that he had apparently understood, in the last years of his life, was one of the few places that Prudhoe's reach did not extend to. Edmund Halverson had died in 1887, the same year his estate had dissolved and the bridge had passed to the county. He had died, the document suggested, having been unable to find a lawyer willing to take the case. Prudhoe's relationships in the territorial legal community were, by 1886, extensive enough to make the case untouchable by anyone who valued their continued practice, and having made the decision, apparently, to preserve the evidence in the one place he trusted and wait for someone who could use it to find it. He had waited 11 years. He had waited in the only form available to the dead, which is the patience of the thing they leave behind. Maren did not tell anyone for 3 days. She needed to read every document twice, needed to map the connections between them, needed to understand not just what they proved but what they could be made to prove in the right hands before the right authority. She used the table in her room at Mrs. Brandt's boarding house, spreading the documents across it each evening after supper and working through them by lamplight with the focused attention of her mother running a finger down a column of figures, finding the line where the error lived. On the 4th day she walked to the post office and asked the postmaster, a deliberate man named Oscar Veen who had been in Sorrow Flat since 1878, whether he knew of a territorial land examiner or a federal surveyor's office she could write to. He looked at her with the careful expression of someone who has learned not to ask questions before understanding why they are being asked, and then said yes, he knew of both, and asked if she needed the addresses. She wrote 2 letters that evening. One to the Federal Surveyor's District Office in Portland. One to a territorial attorney in Salem whose name Mrs. Brandt had offered unprompted one afternoon, saying only that he was the kind of man who did not mind making enemies of other lawyers when the cause was clear enough. The response to her opposition came before the responses to her letters. Prudhoe had informants in Sorrow Flat, she had expected this, having watched how men of his type maintained their networks, and word reached him, through channels she never fully traced, that a woman in Sorrow Flat was in possession of documents from the Halverson estate. He sent a man named Cutter, who arrived in town on a Tuesday carrying a letter from the county commissioner's office asserting that all materials from the dissolved Halverson estate were county property and subject to immediate surrender. Cutter was approximately 50, broad through the shoulders, with the practiced effect of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room and finding that this solved most problems before they required further effort. He arrived at the bridge. Maren had taken to working there each morning, repairing the decking with lumber she had bought on account from the general store, and presented his letter with the air of a formality that was not really a formality. Maren was on her knees replacing a decking board when he arrived. She did not stand up immediately. She finished driving the nail she was driving, set her hammer down on the floor beside her, and then stood, and looked at the letter, and said that she would need to consult with her attorney before responding to any claims on property she had purchased legally from the county, and that she expected a response from her attorney within the fortnight. Cutter said he was not sure she understood the urgency of the matter. Maren said she was quite sure she understood it. He left. He came back 4 days later with a different letter, this one asserting that the bridge itself had been sold in error and that the county was voiding the transaction. Maren had, by then, received a preliminary letter from the attorney in Salem, a man named Jacobson, terse and precise in his correspondence as a man who charges by the word learns to be, confirming that the documents she had described constituted potential grounds for a federal survey challenge and that he was prepared to travel to Sorrow Flat to review the originals at her convenience. She sent Cutter away with a written response directing all further communication to Jacobson's office. Prudhoe made one further attempt, a legal filing in the county court challenging her ownership of the bridge on procedural grounds, which Jacobson addressed in a response brief that was, by the account of the county court clerk who later described it to Oscar Veen, remarkable for the density of its documentation and the quietness of its language and the absolute completeness with which it foreclosed every avenue of procedural challenge. The Federal Survey Review was opened in September of 1891. The examiner arrived from Portland with 2 assistants and spent 3 weeks in the Millhaven Valley reviewing original survey records against the documents from the satchel and against the official county records that Prudhoe's clerk had altered. The alterations, when placed beside Fitch's 1879 originals, were not subtle. They had been made by someone confident that the originals no longer existed, someone who had not anticipated the existence of a copy made by a meticulous surveyor and preserved in the rafters of a covered bridge by a dying man who had trusted that the right person would eventually find them. The Federal Review found in favor of the original survey in every disputed case. 14 families in the Millhaven Valley had their titles restored. Maren's 41 acres were returned to her by federal order in November of 1891, the deed reissued in her name with a notation that the prior absorption had been conducted under fraudulent documentation. Prudhoe resigned his commissionership in October, before the federal findings were formally published. The circumstances of the resignation were described in the territorial press as voluntary, which was the word used for departures that were not voluntary but whose true nature all parties preferred not to document. The county clerk who had made the alterations was dismissed and subsequently charged under territorial statute with falsification of public records. The territorial legislator who had helped draft the 1889 Act announced, in early 1892, that he would not seek re-election. Christopher came down from the timber camp when Maren wrote him the news, arriving in Sorrow Flat on a cold November afternoon with his pack and the unhurried way of moving through a room that was his grandmother Sigrid's quality in him, and he stood in the doorway of the restored covered bridge, which Maren had by then fully repaired, the decking replaced, the siding boards renailed, the roof reshingled in the weeks when the legal process was running its course and she needed work to do with her hands, and looked at the length of it and at his mother and said, quietly, that he thought they had better go home. They went home in the spring of 1892. The 41 acres were exactly as she had left them, which is to say they were overgrown and unplanted and waiting, the way land waits when no one who loves it is present, with the particular patience of a thing that does not require its value to be recognized in order to retain it. She never recovered the $11. She recovered everything else. We began this story on a gray Thursday morning in Sorrow Flat, with a woman standing at the edge of a bridge that went from mud to mud and seeing in it something that nobody else had been willing to see. We want to end it there too, not at the 41 acres, not at the federal finding, not at the quiet departure of Harlan Prudhoe from the public life he had used as an instrument of private theft, but at the bridge, and at the moment that mattered most, which was not the moment the documents were found but the moment before it, when Maren Elstad climbed a ladder in the dark interior of a structure everyone else had written off and moved on her hands and knees through the warm trapped air of the rafter space looking for something she could not yet name. She had not known what she would find. She had known only what her father had taught her, that the surface told you almost nothing and the interior told you almost everything, and that the things most worth finding were almost always in the places no one else had thought to look. She had carried that lesson through a marriage and a loss and a farm and a theft and a departure, and she had carried it into the rafters of an 80-foot covered bridge on a branch of the Millhaven River that no longer served any purpose anyone could articulate, and it had been waiting there for her the way the truest lessons always wait, not announcing themselves, not insisting, simply present, in the place where patience and attention finally arrive together. Edmund Halverson had built that bridge to last. He had hidden those documents because he believed, even as the law was being bent around him, that the truth had a longer life than the men who were trying to bury it. He had been right about both things. The bridge was still standing when Maren's grandchildren were born, long after the river branch it spanned had been entirely forgotten as a feature of the landscape. People who crossed it on foot and asked its history were told it had been saved by a woman who had paid $11 for it at a time when nobody else would bid. What she had found in the rafters was told differently depending on who was telling it, the way stories always are when they belong to a whole community rather than a single person. But the version that persisted longest, the one the oldest residents of Sorrow Flat repeated to their grandchildren on winter evenings, was the simplest one. She had looked where no one else would look, and what she found there had given everyone back what was theirs. That was Maren Elstad. That was what $11, a rotten bridge, and a willingness to climb a ladder in the dark turned out to mean. We want to thank you for sitting with us through this one. Maren's story is the kind that stays with us long after the telling, not because it is easy or because it ends without cost, but because it is about the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, the courage of someone who keeps looking carefully at the world even after the world has been careless with them. If this story found you at the right moment, we would be grateful if you passed it along to someone else who might need it tonight. A like, a share, and a subscription are what keep this fire going and these stories coming, and we do not take any of them for granted. Before you go, we have one question, and we mean it genuinely. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found something of real value in a place everyone else had already walked past without stopping? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.